All right, so we're right at the start time, 2 o'clock Eastern Standard Time. So let's go ahead and get started. First off, good afternoon and welcome. I'm Jason Thomas. I'm a project engineer here at America Makes, and I'll be your host for today's America Makes TRX webinar series. Just a little background on the TRX webinar series before I introduce our speakers. As America Makes continues its mission to expand and accelerate the footprint of additive manufacturing and 3D printing, this medium called the America Makes Technical Review and Exchange webinar series was created. By creating this platform, it allows the additive manufacturing and 3D printing community to come together and to share knowledge and experience with the broader community. If you or your team are interested in presenting during the TRX webinar series, you can navigate to americamakes.us membership and click on the TRX webinar series box. Once there, you can fill out a member request form and we will contact you. A few important notes before we kick off the series. At the end of the presentation, there will be an opportunity for a brief question and answer session. So if during the presentation you have any questions, please submit it in the chat space on your team's screen, and we'll ask it during that Q&A session. We will do our best to get all of your questions answered. Today's webinar is on 3DP, AM market and forecasting 2023 review and 2024 preview. Without further ado, it is my pleasure to introduce our speakers, Matt Kremenetsky and Scott Dunham. Scott Dunham is Executive Vice President of Research at Additive Manufacturing Research, or AM Research. He has authored dozens of in-depth market research studies on various aspects of the 3D printing industry, giving him one of the widest perspectives on the technology in the world. He has spoken at many prestigious events and is regularly consulted and cited by industry-leading companies. Matt Kremenetsky is the macro analyst for 3dprint.com and AM Research, writing about advanced manufacturing from a geopolitical perspective. As such, Matt focuses primarily on deployment of AM in the context of military applications and other strategic sectors. He lives in Aurora, Illinois, in the heartland of American manufacturing. Matt, Scott, I'll now turn it over to you and your team. Go ahead and take it away.
All right. Well, thank you for that introduction, Jason. I'm going to advance the slides here, and I'm going to go off video after just a brief intro here. Thanks, everybody, for joining. I've been told that this is the most highly attended, or at least in terms of registrations, webinars in this series so far, so that's very nice to hear, and I appreciate everybody being here. Before I get too far down the path here of all the insights and the numbers and all the review and stuff that we ultimately want to cover, I'm going to give an agenda that will, kind of give you some guidance on what to expect the rest of the afternoon. We're looking at the title slide right now, Additive Market Size and Forecast Review. So basically what we're hoping to do with this is give all the attendees out there kind of our thoughts, or at least some of them in terms of how the additive market, kind of shook out in the last calendar year, 2023. What our expectations and how some of those trends might continue through this year in 2024. And of course, we're going to do this from a somewhat visual and data perspective, because at AM Research, that's kind of one of the things that we do in terms of our data services and market analysis and opportunity sizing, stuff like that. So we'll talk about that very briefly here in just a second. All right, so now that I'm off video, hopefully everybody can see the presentation agenda slide here. We're obviously in the introduction portion. We're going to move after this into a brief discussion on the methodology behind some of the data that you'll see, which I think is very important and definitely something that should be done or should be discussed when consuming market data, and we'll talk about that. We'll talk about what we saw, kind of like the calendar year, or how things shook out in 2023 just after that, and then we're going to move into a little bit of a more detailed view, bringing in Matt to talk about government influence in additive markets, because we think that's a really big deal going forward. So we'll get some deeper insights from Matt into that, and then we're going to go through some of the data as well for the additive market overall, and breaking it down into some smaller bites and go over some trends, and then finally we'll finish with a summary of some of our expectations for 2024 and beyond. Okay, so you can probably see me there on the screen. That's me. There's really no need to reintroduce myself. I am Executive Vice President of Additive Manufacturing Research. A lot of what you'll see is stuff that I and our team also have been working on, over the last year. about AM Research as a company itself. You may or may not be as familiar with us, with the recent or relatively recent kind of rebranding and name change to better reflect, what it is really that we're about, which is research specific and consulting services specific to the additive manufacturing space. We're not a consultancy or market research firm that focuses on, a lot of different areas, and depending on what day of the week it is or whatever. We have, for the past 10 years, only focused on the additive manufacturing sector. And so that's really kind of like our passion, and what we do day in and day out is look at these technologies in this market. So we provide industry analysis reports, consulting services, that type of stuff for a lot of the stakeholders in the industry. We like to think we're one of the broadest and deepest sources in this area or in these areas specific to additive manufacturing. So it's covering, a lot of the entire value chain, a lot of the different, kind of detailed areas that you can, look at this from: applications, technologies, and printer development, all these other areas, which of course we'll talk about a lot today. We do a lot of proprietary kind of market research stuff for on a custom basis, but one of the things that we're pulling from today as well are our advisory services, which are a subscription-based thing where we're providing like quarterly updates on market tracking, in terms of the numbers, system sales, and all the cool stuff that everybody wants to kind of keep track of. That's what we're going to be pulling from a lot today, and that's one of the things that we're heavily involved in these days. All right. So how do we track and size the additive manufacturing market? I know some of you out there are probably tuning in and just wanting to, cut to the chase and want to see some charts and graphs, the growth rates, all that good stuff. That if you've been following this for a long time, is kind of interesting. This has historically been a pretty high growth market, so I get it. Trust me, I'm one of those people too. Having been involved in tracking and forecasting this market for over 10 years now, though, I got to make a quick detour into the background methodology and why I think that covering it is so important to understand when reviewing data sources like this or others. So when you consume data, it's important that you have the proper contextual understanding already in mind when you're viewing it. So different sources usually have or potentially very different definitions and inclusions or exclusions when sizing an entire industry. So you got to understand that if you're making even semi-serious decisions on the basis of certain data, that you need to make sure that your perception of it is not different than what's actually being, what's intended to be conveyed by that data, right? So now let's see, I'm going to throw up a chart for you guys on 2023 additive market growth. And we'll talk about some of the basics there, and then we'll kind of tie that into the methodology discussion before we move on. So right now you can kind of see a pretty simple graph from one of our databases. This is, the professional kind of additive industry overall view. And you can see the headline there. We're comparing worldwide AM market revenues under our definitions, which we have not covered yet, but I will shortly. But I wanted to show this as a live example kind of why we stress methodology and transparency here at AM Research. You can see the 4 colored bars above each of the 2 compared years, 2022 and 2023, right there, and then the different segments of the AM industry in terms of dollar value. So the big top line for 2023 was that, under our definition, that is based around AM systems or hardware, print materials, AM specific software, and production printing services. You can see those 4 segments there, that the overall AM industry grew about 13% in 2023 versus the prior year, 2022. So this growth, was almost entirely outside of systems or hardware, printers. They were very flat year to year, only grew about 5%. There's going to be a lot more on that later. You can see, kind of by these colored bars here, draw some conclusions there. But we're talking about a growth from roughly $13 billion by our definition in 2022, up to not quite $15 billion in 2023. So for some historical context, this level of growth, was depressed a little bit compared to the historical norm, in the additive industry. If you go back 20, 30 years, you're seeing consistently, or pretty consistently, I should say, between 15 and 30% growth rates year over year. So this is a little bit on the, the lower side of that. And we'll get into, a lot of the trends and stuff that play into that. But I would say the biggest thing that you'll see, at least in this graph, is that hardware for the year was pretty flat, but there were some bright spots in some other areas like materials and services. All right, so having looked at that, let's talk about the most important part of forecast data consumption. Having seen the previous slide with the baseline 2023 additive market growth, I would say the most important part of data consumption is knowing what is being counted or tracked in the data you're viewing and what may not be relative to your existing perception. So if you compare various market data sources out there for the additive industry activity and market size, you'll find it's not all the same from this standpoint. And unfortunately, this isn't always made obvious. So today, we're going to make sure that it is. So when we look at data today, the previous slide, all the slides to come with data on them, what's being included or counted in the data, like what you just saw, and probably more importantly than that, what is not being included in that? Well, for starters, our market sizing is based on professional industry activity alone, which means it's excluding all personally owned printing systems. That is a fairly prominent market opportunity, but it's not really what we focused on historically at AM Research. So we're talking about just printers and activity related to basically the business side of things, generating revenue for a business, something like that. This methodology does not exclude desktop printers entirely, as there's quite a few of those also sold for business purposes. But just so we're defining what we are and what we are not counting, that's one of the biggest things to remember, is that we're talking about the professional industry, additive manufacturing industry. In the metal segment, we're tracking and including today only powder-based metal AM technologies. So this includes systems that utilize a powder-based material, as well as on the material side for shipments, that's powder only, obviously. So basically, any activity around wire-based AM, like in DED, for example, directed energy deposition, or various melted or liquid metal deposition technologies, is not included in the data. On the hardware revenue or printing system revenues, these are representative only of base system access and the base system itself, as well as like baseline included accessory equipment that is pretty much always included when you purchase that printer. This means that stuff like aftermarket and in highly industrialized post-processing equipment that has come on the scene in the last couple of years is not included in this data. And then finally, with regard to print services, this is representative only of the concept of printing parts as a service in exchange for money, and any cost that might be directly included in that as part of that process. So basically what we mean here is the services revenue data that you see does not include like machine service contract revenues reported in this segment, as some companies, like publicly reported companies, are often reporting under the umbrella of services as some of these machine maintenance contracts. That's not the case here. This is, when we say print services, we're talking about only production of parts for money between two parties. Okay, and then the last point I want to make on this slide relates to a term that we've used already, which is counting. Counting of things infers that we simply have an amount of something where the whole quantity is known, and it's simply a matter of kind of tallying it up and breaking it up into little pieces. The problem with this approach from a methodological standpoint, and when you're doing this type of work, is that when it comes to sizing detailed aspects of an industry, is that you only have to, you're really only able to use macro level measuring or grouping in order to be able to count a quantity to arrive at a total. So this gets into kind of the methodology that we use here at AM Research to track the industry. We haven't shown any detailed data yet, just pretty high level stuff. But this is one of the areas that kind of, I think, sets us apart a little bit. We utilize market modeling approaches that are based on the ecosystem of the AM industry itself, which are informed by various counting sources like survey inputs or government data sources, public financials, stuff where we can count up and tally things. But those inputs are used as a means to fill in all the important smaller details that are based on our deep understanding of how AM works, and we bring all that together in a modeling approach. So to tie a knot on the methodology standpoint before we move on, is if we were to describe our data modeling approach in just kind of one sentence, we would quote the American cinematic masterpiece, The Patriot, with Mel Gibson, and say that our general approach is to aim small, miss small. So in the context of tracking and forecasting, what this essentially means is that we try to model out the small elements of the industry and then connect them together in a way that reflects how the real industry works, because we've been in the industry a long time. By breaking down this work into small detailed elements, we can minimize our capacity for error and maximize our capacity for detailed insights. Obviously, if you aren't making this a full-time effort and are very familiar with additive processes and business models and applications and all those things, this is going to be a very difficult task. But that's one that we feel like we're up to the challenge for. So you can see in this slide how we kind of approach things methodologically. We track hardware and system sales as a baseline for everything else we report on, and then we split that activity out by the various leading AM process segments, like metal powder bed fusion, for example. And you can see that on the left side of this slide here. We'll track various influential vendors, like in this tech segment, and track their unit sales, resulting install bases, and then apply printer utilization models to arrive at things like material consumption and material type output splits for the materials portion of our data. So all this is done kind of like at a geographical and end user industry level, so that we can apply all the nuanced findings on AM applications and real world factors to the model that we've learned over the years. And of course, a lot of this data is either input from suppliers actively in the market, it's triangulated using known sources, and then it's also quality checked against other sources and stakeholder feedback and other sources of data that we can gather. So it's kind of both a ground up and a top down approach. All right, so now let's bring it back, high level data. Again, instead of looking at 2023, now we're going to look kind of like a year ahead, so 2023 and to 2024. So now that we've got the right conceptualization of the data and how it's tracked and tabulated, we'll do some high-level market insight here, but this time covering some of our expectations. We saw our total industry number, again, based on what we're tracking and excluding what we aren't, at 14.7 billion for 2023 last year. And as of right now, we expect some positive momentum this year to bring us back closer to that historical growth level of about 20%, growing to roughly 17.5 billion for 2024. From the by segment perspectives, we're basing this expectation on the AM systems will once again begin to grow in terms of revenues after a pretty flat year last year. But also we're combining that with a continuation of momentum that we're seeing in print materials and print services. So one of the biggest trends we want to call out that we're really expecting, at this stage to really form up in 2024 and probably also the next, few years consequently after that, is government-led investments in the additive world. So by our view, this is probably going to be one of, if not maybe the single biggest influencing factor in the AM market for the next year or two. This is stemming from underlying trends that we've seen coming for a few years and are now just kind of coming to a head and are sort of translating into some real dollars and cents, including priorities for national defense, as well as securing supply chains in a geopolitically unstable world. Since we're calling this out specifically as one of the major drivers and expectations for growth for the relatively near term, at this point, I'm going to bring in our macro analyst at 3dprint.com, Matt Kremenetsky, who Jason also already introduced. He recently co-authored a market report on additive in government and defense for AM, and that was for AM research. So I'm going to bring him in now to talk more about some of the strengths and weaknesses we're expecting in the government sector when we talk about its influence in the additive world. So I'll pass it over to Matt now to unpack some of that and before we dive deeper into the data. Matt?
Thanks, Scott. That was a great intro. And I think America Makes is the perfect forum to have this sort of discussion in, because America Makes has long been at the forefront of what is now becoming the forefront for U.S. government policy as a whole, which is revitalizing the U.S. industrial base. An important thing to keep in mind is that when the DoD talks about the defense industrial base, especially nowadays, it is not a limited concept. So what the US government has learned from COVID, from Russia's invasion of Ukraine, and now from the escalating conflict in the Middle East, is that you can't really separate the health of the manufacturing sector at large from the health of the defense sector. If you don't design public policy accordingly, you can't really insulate your defense production capacity from the fact that you're outsourcing all the manufacturing jobs to nations all over the world, nations that in many cases you're also in strategic competition with. This isn't to say that there were no such policies aiming to address these issues before, but as the NDIS, the National Defense Industrial Strategy, which was released this past January, as the NDIS emphasizes, the policies weren't enough. Now, this has started to change, and AM is, interestingly enough, a central part of that story. Obviously, I'm focused on AM every day as part of my job, so it would be natural for me to overestimate its importance, but you don't have to reach to say that. AM is now a central part of DoD policy. That's an important shift that has only really just started to truly sink into the industry's landscape. In addition to being a good forum for this discussion, this is also a good time to have this discussion right after last week's Sea, Air, Space Symposium, which is the Navy's largest trade show. At that event, at least a few notable remarks were made referencing AM either indirectly or directly. For one thing, Laura Taylor Kale, whose office released the NDIS, noted that the policy prioritization at the heart of the document is already having a positive impact on the maritime space. Taylor Kale, the Assistant Secretary of Defense for Industrial Base Policy, said that rocket motors were one example of this, which are a major success story for AM right now, solid rocket motors. In fact, there's at least 2 different varieties of solid rocket motors being made right now with AM. Ones with powder bed fusion, like the ones that Ursa Major makes, and ones with DED, like Northrop Grumman does with a printer made by GKN Aerospace. There was also a panel at that event called Additive Manufacturing, Creating a Warfighting Advantage Through Materiel Readiness, which is pretty much what America Makes does on a daily basis, by the way. But in that panel, the moderator, the president of the Naval Postgraduate School, retired Vice Admiral Anne Rondow, put it pretty nicely, I think, in terms of the connection between AM and the Defense Industrial Base. She said, "This is not a culture that we do not understand. This is not a topic new to the United States Navy or the Marine Corps. Manufacturing while you're on the go is what we do." So that really touches on the exact supply chain resilience and response to geopolitical instability that Scott was talking about. In that same panel, someone from the private sector, an AM fellow at Pratt & Whitney, gave America Makes a shout out. He said, "I would encourage everyone to get involved in standards committees such as ASTM, ASME, ISO, initiatives like AM Forward and America Makes." And then he said, "I'm not expecting anyone to be an AM expert at the end of the panel, but really just informed AM users." And I think that's the right advice for people who want to keep the industry moving forward in the right direction right now, is to get as involved as possible with standardization. So along those same lines, to make sure I don't ignore the aspects where AM is still facing roadblocks, there was a great story in Defense News last week by Noah Robertson and Megan Eckstein, where they talked to an AM program manager at Naval Sea Systems Command, Mark Massey, on the show floor of Sea, Air, Space. And he said that there's 3 major challenges for AM in the military right now. He said DoD needs to send companies clearer demand signals. It needs to simplify the process for buying 3D printing materials. And the third challenge was testing the materials. So everyone in the industry, especially on the metals side, knows how much of a challenge that last one is. And it's one of the biggest reasons why organizations like America Makes exist. The last one is a technological problem. So that's going to get sorted out with standardization, which simply takes time and work. And the other 2 are certainly challenges, but I think they're manageable challenges. And I think that to a large extent, you can start to tackle those problems by tackling standardization. So I think the government can do a better job at sending demand signals by signaling the materials and the parts that it thinks need to be prioritized in terms of standardization. And in some cases, it's already doing a very good job of that, with rocket motors, like I just mentioned, being one example. And another really good example is the submarine industrial base, which I'm sure all of you are aware of the progress that the Navy has been making in the last couple of years. But I think by accelerating the standardization of parts and materials and bringing more new small companies into the fold, the government can also ultimately make it easier for its own departments to purchase 3D printing materials. So in this case, it would be a story of success breeding more success. You know, the more companies that have success selling 3D printing materials to the government, the easier it'll be to convince people to routinize this process. And in this case, I think we've already seen some success stories recently as well, notably 6K Inc. and Hyperion X. Generally, though, to get back to what I said at the beginning, the biggest problem for 3D printing in the defense sector is a macro one, and it's a problem faced by all of US industries. So, you know, this is not something that's limited to the defense sector. It's a problem that touches on the defense sector by way of the manufacturing sector at large. In the very near future, we will need many more manufacturing workers than it looks like there will be in this country if the current trajectory continues. Even and especially for the defense sector, the manufacturing workforce in all the other sectors has to be robust as well. But what's clear from the NDIS, though, and what's clear from Laura Taylor Kale's remarks at Sierra Space is that at the very least, the DoD knows how urgently this exact issue needs to be addressed. At the very beginning of the NDIS, as the second biggest challenge for implementing the strategy effectively, it points to what it refers to as an inadequate workforce. And the NDIS says the labor market lacks the required number of skilled workers to meet defense production demand while driving innovation at all levels. This shortfall is becoming exacerbated as baby boomers retire and younger generations show less interest in manufacturing and engineering careers. The DoD and the government as a whole have started to address this problem as well, which Assistant Secretary Taylor Kale also pointed out at Sierra Space. So she talked about the Metallurgical Engineering Trades Apprenticeship and Learning, which is an acronym, METAL program, which advances efforts to get more young people involved in casting and forging. So, you know, it's slow, but slowly but surely, the public and private sectors are both ramping up their efforts and their efforts jointly to raise awareness of the need to bring more young people into the manufacturing workforce. So beyond the numbers, beyond the standards, and beyond use cases, there is the very general problem of simply getting more tools like 3D printers, and in my opinion, my biased opinion, especially 3D printers, into the hands of more Americans, and especially young Americans. That is a challenge, but again, I think it's a challenge that the more that it's addressed, the more all of those other problems start to get solved as well. And I think this kind of frames everything properly in its long-term context. A recent Deloitte study said the US needs 3.8 million manufacturing workers by 2033. And the same study said that there's a serious risk of 1.9 million, which is half of those jobs, going unfilled. On the bright side, I think that organizations like America Makes and people like the ones tuning into this webinar are the best resources we have for eliminating that risk. And every time you teach someone in the next generation how to use a tool to do something constructive, you're tangibly increasing the odds for a better future. So that's what I got. Thank you.
All right. Matt, thank you very much. That was extremely informative and very detailed. So we're going to keep on that that theme of kind of like a deeper dive on the data side now, getting back to the additive manufacturing market specifically and some 2023 results. Let's see. Okay, so we're going to start because, you know, we take it to the next kind of layer of depth, the discussion in terms of market trends from last year. And stuff that's probably going to continue on throughout this year and maybe even beyond. We can't really disconnect the influence of AM system developments, you know, in the business from the other areas of the industry. So we're just going to start with some hardware insights here. So with the data I presented earlier showing AM system sales pretty flat for last year, that total tally was about 2.8 billion worldwide if you take into account metal and non-metal systems. One area that we've seen slightly stronger growth in, at least, is in those technologies which have an established offering for smaller and lower cost systems. This is probably unsurprising at this point, given the last couple of years of kind of financial turmoil and inflation and interest rates and things. But so these systems might be less productive, and industrialized, but we've really seen a return to growth in this area relative to past years in the context of professional investment and use, to the point where revenues from this side of things are showing up more strongly, even with falling system prices, and lots of competition in certain segments of the AM hardware segment. So this is a trend in both metal systems and polymer systems, which are shown here in these two charts from our database. So on the left, we have polymer AM systems. That's kind of those blue bars. And you can see that from 2022 to 2023, the professional and production machine classification segment was pretty flat. It was almost perfectly flat, really, at about 1.1 billion between both years. So just a 2.5% growth in 2023, estimated across all polymer technologies in this classification. So this classification is think of the more industrialized and costlier printers. There's not a specific price point that we cut this off at, because every segment now is kind of developing sort of its own kind of distinct classification for what is considered kind of a higher end system. It might be $30,000 in powder bed fusion versus and higher in one case, or it might be $3,000 and higher in, say, material extrusion. So we're doing this on a technology by technology basis and kind of rolling it all up. So a 2.5% growth estimated in the production and professional printers on the polymer side. But if you look at just the other side of that same graph, on the desktop and prosumer side, we saw about double that level of growth in revenue at about 5%, which is really even more impressive when you consider that these machines are very much a volume-driven type of market, and not necessarily, obviously, a price-driven type of market. And we've even seen pricing pressure in these lower-cost systems as well, with a lot of international competition driving prices down. And this is something that's being seen, of course, it's most notable in material extrusion, but now it's even being seen in other areas of the industry. So concurrently in metals, small and medium build chamber size systems, typically with a single or maybe dual lasers, saw kind of a similar dynamic with stronger growth in that segment compared to the larger, ultra expensive, large build area and often mini laser type of systems. That's in metal powder bed fusion. And you can see that data there kind of on the right side with those yellow and green bars. You can see that small and medium PBF systems had a more significant growth than the large and extra large PBF systems, which really, again, is especially impressive considering the vast price differences that we tend to see in there. So the driving forces behind lower cost systems, it is a little bit different in each segment, so polymer versus metal. But in metals, we think that kind of the baseline sticker cost of a lot of the machines that have been heavily developed and thrust to the forefront of the industry over the last couple of years, they're very highly industrialized. So now that kind of like that base investment cost is a little bit more of a barrier now, due to higher financing costs. Even though the cost per part potential has been improved with these types of machines, really what makes it kind of real, the challenge real, is the implementing these systems is still very challenging at a time, a lengthy process. So even though you can print cheaper parts with some of these systems, or depends on the part, I suppose, but in general, the cost per part with these types of highly productive, very expensive systems is going down. That's what we want. We want cheaper parts. Just kind of the current financial environment actually is making investing in those challenging when you take into account multi-million-dollar, upfront costs, as well as a really long implementation timeline and maybe some unknowns that you really kind of have to figure out along the way. So that's kind of resulted in the appetite for metal AM shifting a little bit. We can see that the overall appetite is absolutely alive and thriving for metal AM, but we're seeing some of that interest translate over to dollars and systems in markets and applications that can be served by machines that don't cost well over $1 million. And often this is in actually machines that are costing about $250,000 or less. So that's one of the interesting things going on the hardware side right now. So as we move forward in the hardware theme, this is an interesting chart that we pulled together here from the database. So it's kind of shows the slow and steady increase in quarterly, quarter-over-quarter system revenues, or sequential quarterly system revenues for AM. So looking at more detail in this one, you can see 6 years worth of quarterly hardware revenues. And the one thing I probably would call out here is that you can see, really, if you focus on just that green, the green lines above the bars, the trend line across the board from across this 6-year period, we're seeing about 60% more on average quarterly revenue today from AM systems of all types than we were 6 years ago. So the growth's been fairly slow and steady with a few ups and downs, and to a degree has been impacted by pricing and sales mix, changes in the various tech segments. But you can see there, if you just look from one side of the graph to the other, we've gone from a quarterly run rate of AM hardware in the low 500 million, worldwide kind of range, all the way up to now, if you go to the right side of the graph here at the end of last year, we're kind of starting to cross that threshold of consistently exceeding 700 million in sales per quarter. And obviously the real rate you can see is kind of up and down. With the pandemic, obviously a lot of the hardware sales had a dip and then came back, and now we're continuing kind of on that same trajectory that sort of we were already on before. Okay, so this slide is a similar look. It looks kind of the same, but what we've changed here is this is unit sales. So we're not talking about the revenues generated of hardware sales, but now we're just talking about the individual number of units. And you can see it's a more stable and aggressive growth rate here. So this again is comparing non-metal and metal systems on a unit basis. And again, the disclaimer down there, don't forget that this doesn't include wire-based DED and some other stuff, in the revenues. But here we see the overall trend line, again, more aggressive in terms of quarterly volume of units sold. So one important thing to note here too is that on the polymer side of this chart alone, we're already excluding all the desktop and prosumer category units. Of course, that's a vast majority of units on the polymer side in terms of just units. So the takeaway here, keeping in mind the last slide, is that the momentum in quarterly unit sales is stronger than revenue, which indicates a couple things ranging from pricing implications and to demand mix. I would distill it down to basically we're able to do a lot more with less than we were 6 years ago. And that is at least in part due to a lot of competitive pressure. And, we all know how many companies exist in the industry developing printers today. And, sometimes that's looked at as a negative, and it's creates various challenges. But if you just kind of boil it down and look at data like this, you can see that the volume and the trend in unit sales of printers is exceeding the revenue generation despite inflation, despite higher prices. And what I think that ultimately boils down to a lot is we are able to do more with less today, which is ultimately a good thing for users. Sticking with the hardware theme here, this is only polymer revenue, and it's broken out now by technology. So this cut shows just AM system revenues worldwide, again, broken out by the 5 primary technology groups tracked in the non-metal segment. We usually associate this with polymers, and it is the overwhelming majority are like polymer-oriented printers, although there are some printers that also process some alternative materials, so we call it non-metals. One interesting comparison that I would call out here is in powder bed fusion specifically. We've seen more than a 100% increase in the quarterly unit sales revenue from Q1 of 2017 up to Q1 of 2023. This has been thanks to a lot of development in that non-metal powder bed fusion area that's centered around industrialization. And now we're kind of starting to see, interestingly, that same trend start to catch on with less expensive systems that are, by most accounts, still highly capable. So here we got to highlight companies like Formlabs, specific to that most recently mentioned trend, but also in industrialized systems, HP and EOS. The 3 of these companies, along with others as well, have really helped extend the non-metal powder bed fusion, kind of like its overall attractiveness, to a number of new areas over the last many years, really, to everything from aligner manufacturing and footwear and eyeglass frames to UAVs and production automotive components. There's just, the list goes on and on. So we've definitely seen a lot of expansion specific to that powder bed fusion segment, which is really exciting for a number of reasons. And then if we take the same look at the metals side, this is the biotechnology breakout in metals for revenues generated from printer sales. It's definitely dominated by metal powder bed fusion, but what we are seeing today is a lot more impact from the other main areas compared to 6 years ago. So DED technology is starting to become really interesting in the context of defense and space. And although a lot of that is, of course, wire-based and therefore not even showing up in this data, even the powder DED stuff is benefiting too a lot from things like repair of critical tooling, feature addition for high-value parts, especially in markets like defense and space where they're less cost sensitive, and it really just comes down to when quick turnaround and the absolute performance of parts. So you can see here also comparing Q1 of 2017 on the left side of that graph to Q1 of 2023 closer to the right, we're seeing stable quarterly trends of worldwide revenues more than double today in Q1 of 2023 than where we were in 2017, even with last year's kind of suppressed investment in metal AM hardware overall. So you can see now that we're running close to about 300 million quarterly consistently for the last about 5 quarters in metal AM, a couple ups and downs in there. Whereas 6 years ago, we were talking about selling, between 100 and maybe $200 million worth of equipment. So we're definitely on the right trajectory here. All right, so now we're going to move on to materials, additive, the materials market, definitely one of the major industry growth drivers in kind of this post-pandemic era. Showing a little more detailed look now here. This is one of the best areas of the industry to be in. You can see that when we aggregate the data like this, the amount of growth is pretty staggering in not that long of a period of time. So if we include what we're expecting for 2024, which again, I'd say we're on the whole cautiously more optimistic compared to 2023, we're talking about on the materials side of having gone from about 2.1 billion overall in all additive materials across metals and polymers and non-metals to a projected 3.85 billion in just 3 years' time. And this is evidenced by companies like Ford AM, who've reported very significant but kind of behind the scenes growth in the last year. On the metal powder side, Carpenter, Tekna, as well as many others in that metal powder segment, also reporting just continuous growth, lots of capacity expansions. And then the big integrated players as well, like 3D Systems and Stratasys, also have been, on their public financials, expounding on consumables revenues as one of the bright spots in their businesses in the last year. So overall, you can see, especially in that darker blue segment there, metal powders. If you look just back to where we were just a couple of years ago, it's just a staggering amount of growth in terms of worldwide revenues generated thanks to AM. And this is being led a lot by somewhat increased utilization rates, more demand for printing, and the companies that do have a stable printing operation up and running, seeing more demand and getting more utilization out of their machines, but also, of course, just the overall productivity improvements of machines where the demand is already more than what the machines can handle. Now we're able to just process more material, right? So there's a lot of things that kind of go into this. We're going to advance here to another material slide. So this is a breakout. It kind of continues this materials trend. It kind of highlights the detail that our market models at AM Research are going to these days. This shows you guys and everybody out there that the top 10 highest revenue generating additive material types across both polymers and metals combined, comparing 2020 to the most recent year, 2023. So this is in order, kind of like a ranked top 10 of material revenue generation by a specific material type in a specific AM process. So, or at least I should say semi-specific, I suppose. The takeaway here is that polymer additive materials are still kind of overall dominating in terms of the total scale of that business, but we're starting to see more metals show up in this kind of top 10 listing today. So titanium powder now in additive is now estimated at the end of 2023 to be over a $200 million worldwide market. But we're also seeing other metals as well, like steels, show up and become a lot higher grossing. And that's thanks in part due to application expansion and more use, but also on the material development side, we've seen a lot of initiatives now where we have a lot more reliably printable steels that manufacturers are familiar and comfortable with, outside of kind of the traditional, just a few, stainless steel grades, 18 nickel 300, and that was about it for many years. So you can see, looking at this a little bit more, resins on the polymer side, if you take into account both those that are used in dentistry, which is one of the most mature AM markets, as I'm sure you know, as well as those for kind of general engineering and industrial purposes, those tend to dominate from a revenue standpoint and are still dominating today. There's a lot of reasons for that. It goes back into, there's applications for prototyping, and now there's more applications for both tooling and some in-use part stuff, as well as on the healthcare side with everything going on in dentistry. But then you have other trends coming through, like in filament materials. No longer are our models showing that, kind of like baseline on, ABS and PLA materials, which are so widely used in kind of the desktop segment. Those are being overtaken by more functional materials with reinforcements in like glass fiber and carbon fiber, stuff like that in the material as well, for more kind of like functional parts, as well as, we still have cobalt, chrome, and steels, and just more metals kind of in general showing up on this. Okay. So now we're looking, one of our last data slides here, additive markets in 2024, some of our expectations for growth, but this is we're breaking this out now for the first time by the end user segments. So we've grouped a few of them together here. We have aerospace, automotive, medical, dental, energy, the market for service bureaus, for additive manufacturing, and then kind of a conglomeration of industrial, consumer, and government stuff that's sort of, it's fairly broad, but it's also a decent size. Well, it's a very big opportunity when you take it into account. This is the last kind of data slide here. We'll unpack some takeaways and summaries. These are showing our 2024 forecasts.
Hey, Scott. Sorry to interrupt. I think we lost your slides there.
Oh, sorry about that.
No, not a problem.
Anything showing up now?
No, I don't think so.
All right, stand by. Let me back out here.
All right.
And if that doesn't end up working, you can shoot it over to us and we'll share it and knock the rest of this out real quick. There it goes.
Yep, we got it. Just going to.
Looking good now?
Yes, sir.
Thank you for stopping me on that. All right.
You're welcome.
So back into it here. This is 2024 market revenues by the different end user segments. You can see kind of some of our expectations here. The left graph is just the pure kind of like the revenues generated when you take into account hardware, materials, and print services together in each of these markets, just the sheer scale of those. And then the right bar graph, going the opposite direction, is the actual year-over-year growth rate, that we're projecting for each of these segments. So some takeaways from this data, we've seen a lot of activity in the mature areas of AM, especially biomedical. There doesn't appear to be any signs of that changing for 2024, so we're pretty bullish on that. If you look at just the growth rate, medical comes in a little bit lower, but that's again because it's one of the more mature areas. On that left-hand chart there with total revenues, you can see that service bureaus obviously don't have any print services revenues attributed to them like the other segments, since they're the ones doing all the printing for everyone else. But what I think is important to note there is for just machines and materials out of service bureaus, it's important to note that we're estimating about $200 million worth of worldwide additional growth in 2024 in that service bureau segment for machine investment and material consumption. And a lot of justification for that, I think, is going to come from areas that are considered critical to national security and defense, to tie it back into what we talked about earlier. So whether that be energy or semiconductor or military equipment, I don't think there's a lot of doubt that service bureaus stand to benefit in the short term from overall government sentiment towards AM technologies today. Governments want to work with partners. They obviously, need manufacturing capacity and companies that are experts in the various processes there. So service bureaus are one of the segments that I think, it might not look super impressive on that left-hand graph, but that is something that, if we talk about $200 million worth of more machines and materials just in 1 year alone, I think that really the way that happens is from a lot of the government investment in AM and some more programs kicking off and things starting to scale up more. Okay, so to summarize kind of some of our outlooks here, we got just another minute or two before we move into the Q&A session. For metals, we think that hardware investments should begin to restart more significantly, especially through service bureaus. Hopefully that kind of are going to be in a position where to take advantage of some of these big opportunities related to government, they're basically going to have to act in terms of adding capacity to prepare for government-backed interests. So while it had been kind of a wait and see and the financial things kind of, causing delays and pushing orders out, now at this point, even if that financial backdrop doesn't change significantly this year, I think we're going to start to see more companies realizing that, if they want to take advantage of what's coming down the pipe, they're going to have to act. Chinese players who were pretty successful in 2023 by most accounts, they're a little more uncertainty this year. All of them, or at least all of the notable ones, are obviously involved in westward expansion. So that from that perspective, it shows promise for them to continue growth. But global instability and kind of the conflicts around the globe, that might change the perception of investment by Western users a little bit in certain markets. In other markets, obviously, that isn't as important. So we're not exactly sure what to expect there, but we are obviously watching it pretty close. And then the market appears pretty receptive to kind of this newer or relatively newer idea of new additive technology players coming in and just acting as contract manufacturers using their technology that they've developed, such as an example of that is Surratt. They want to capitalize on the appetite for AM while alleviating the issues of complex integration and adoption that we mentioned earlier that are kind of like have been one of the main factors deterring investment in machine sales when you take into account the financial pressures as well. So for polymers, overall, the global economic sentiment, it's up and down, but it continues to, I think, overall improve quarter to quarter. That should help increase general manufacturing activity kind of at a gradual pace, and therefore prototyping activity, which had been depressed, according to a lot of service bureaus and things, should return to, I would assume, somewhat normal levels in probably the second half of this year. Dental consumer activity, of course, the polymer dental AM market is one of the most important ones, and that's been challenging, mainly due to consumer discretionary spending being impacted by inflation. We think AM will continue to grow modestly in dental this year because it's spread to basically every corner of the dental industry. So obviously some level of dentistry goes on regardless, and additive is just well positioned to continue to take more and more of that. And then a return to growth, or at least stronger growth in print services, we're expecting that to be observable in 2024, thanks to a number of factors combining, including that gradually improving prototyping activity, but also government-driven defense initiatives, which need supporting partners. And we've seen a lot of those, like we talk a lot about the metals, but really when you dig into it, a lot of those parts, are proof of concept, and a lot of times they're polymers. And the government, the Army and specifically has talked about expanding that activity as well. So with that, I will turn my video back on, and I think Jason will call you back in here to deal with some questions.
Yeah, great presentation, guys. So, yeah, Matt, Scott, thank you very much. We'll now head into the Q&A session. If you have questions for our presenters and you haven't done so already, please go ahead and get them into the chat. We did get quite a few questions, so I'm going to go ahead and start off with an easy one that I can answer. So will the slides of the recording be available? Yes, these slides will be available on the America Makes YouTube page in the coming days. Also, if you are on the America Makes newsletter mailing list, which I hope you are, we always have a video on demand section in our newsletter, so you can also go there and view any of our TRX webinar series from the past. All right, moving on. So let's see, what is the main driver for AM market growth? It seems that service had the major contribution.
So in the past year, the main driver, was a combination of materials and services as well. Obviously, the hardware was not a significant factor last year, but if you take into account, when you look at those two things, what that really suggests is that the appetite for additive manufacturing didn't significantly change in the last year, even though we kind of, have heard about that in public financials and stuff. But a lot of that is coming from companies that are, invested in selling printers and fairly expensive ones. We don't see necessarily that the appetite for AM has shifted a lot. Obviously, I mentioned a little bit less prototyping activity, and that's tied to lower manufacturing rates overall. But generally speaking, especially as we kind of continue down this path of shoring up supply chains and the national defense, reinvigoration spending in that, the appetite for AM is definitely still there. So that's kind of why you see services and materials playing a little bit bigger role last year. And we think that that'll still be the case this year. It's just that we're also expecting hardware to kind of have to now as well sort of be reinvigorated, alongside it.
All right. Thank you very much. All right. Moving on. So let's see. So wondering if the speakers could elaborate on the use of the term standardization. So I guess, what does that mean to you?
So I like that question because it can be both a very narrow and a very broad term. I think I mean it in both the literal sense of materials characterization and testing, and actually published standards like in ASTM, and also just in general technological maturity that's measured by things like the technological readiness levels and manufacturing readiness levels, because I think those two things go hand in hand. I don't see any technology really reaching maturity without increased number of standards, and at the same time I think you have to have a good case for commercialization to on the flip side kind of incentivize accelerated standard like technical standards. So I mean it in basically as broad and as narrow a term as possible, if that helps.
All right, thank you very much. All right, so let's see. Here's another one here. What are the top unmet needs in the AM market today?
Oh man. Well, we hear all the time about unmet needs. I don't know, ranking them is difficult. I would say one that is consistent and has been consistent year over year, and still has not necessarily been solved, is something that we talked about, is kind of like implementation challenges. So we've done lots of work with bringing cost per part down for certain technologies, at least down relative to where it was. I'm sure, of course, everybody wants lower cost per part regardless of what they are, but that's not necessarily going to do it in itself. Like there's definitely, I would say, kind of like easing the implementation challenges that go along with additive, and that comes from everything from having to certify and test a machine for a period of 6 to 9 months upon delivery, after a fairly lengthy installation program. That type of thing does tend to delay scale up and cause challenges, because then if during that process something's wrong, obviously you're starting from square one, and that kind of ties back into, I think, we're seeing growing in certain customers and certain users, we're seeing a lot more confidence in additive manufacturing technologies, and that kind of is breeding a lot more faster movement, and we're starting to see that risk aversion where applicable kind of change a little bit, and that's helping, but we need that kind of across the board. So I guess that would be my answer for that.
All right, great. All right, so we're kind of running out of time here. I'll forward the rest of the questions to you guys, and you could follow up, after the event if you want to. So that's going to wrap up today's TRX webinar series. I would like to once again thank Matt and Scott. That was a great presentation, great information. Once again, this will be available on the YouTube page, America Makes YouTube page, and also in our upcoming newsletters. If you do have further questions for either of these gentlemen, you can reach out to them at the email address that is shared on the screen now. And as a reminder, if you think you or your organization would be interested in sharing on the TRX webinar series, you can go to our website and fill out the request form, or you can reach out to Zane Ross at zane.ross@ncdmm.org. Thanks, everyone, and have a great day.